Recording in progress.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the official launch of the April 2024 East Asia and Pacific Economic Update. My name is Gitanjali Chopra, and I'm the Manager for Communications for the East Asia and Pacific region. We will begin our engagement today with opening remarks from the East Asia and Pacific World Bank Vice President, Manuela Ferro. And that will be followed by the presentation by our Chief Economist for East Asia Pacific, Aditya Mattu. We're also very pleased to have with us today, and they will come in later in a panel discussion, Dr. Muhammad Chatib Basri, who is a former Minister of Finance for Indonesia and the current chairman of PT Bank Mandiri and PTXL Axiata. Irene Omar, the president of Capital A. She's the president for investment and ventures of Capital A, formerly the AirAsia Group. And Lalita Murthy, who's the World Bank Regional Director for Equitable Growth, Finance and Infrastructure for the EAP region. So without further ado, let me hand over to our Vice President, Manuela Ferro.
Thank you very much, Gitanjali, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm very pleased you could join us for a presentation and a conversation on the April 2024 edition of our economic update for the East Asia and the Pacific. As you may know, this is a report we produce every 6 months, and it contains essentially two parts. The first one looks at recent economic developments and gives you a sense of the economic outlook as we see it for the region. And there is a second part that is on a special topic, and this time we look at the foundations of growth, which is really related to productivity growth in firms. And that generated quite a bit of interest, and the findings are fascinating. So this report is prepared by our regional chief economist and his team, Aditya, and he will also make the presentation. So before I turn to Aditya, let me say just a few words of introduction and a few headlines. Starting with the outlook, the good news is that this is a region that is growing. It is growing faster than the rest of the world. We are projecting for 2024 a robust 4.5% growth, moderating a little bit to 4.3 in 2025. And these are strong growth rates, robust growth rates, but lower than we have seen in this region, namely before the pandemic, say between 2015 and 2019. In the region, the largest economy, China, is projected to grow at 4.5% in 2024. But we do know, and I want to make a parenthesis here, that the Chinese authorities are planning to introduce further stimulus to the economy so that they get closer to their target of around 5%. Now, in the rest of the region, we do see a projection for us of 4.6% in 2024 and 4.3% in 2025. I also wanted to speak a little bit about the Pacific, which faces obviously much different conditions from the rest of the region. And here, after a strong rebound from COVID in 2023, where the Pacific saw a growth of 5.6%. We see this growth coming down a little bit in 2024 with tourist arrivals plateauing and a little bit less spending by tourism. And so we're projecting 3.6% growth in 2024. Now, this outlook is influenced and shaped by a context that has both important external and domestic factors in several of the economies of the region and the markets to which they export. This is a region that has prospered significantly on the basis of a strong and very competitive set of exports. And therefore demand in the rest of the world really matters. So first, on positive news, is external global trade is starting to recover. We saw a very limited recovery in 2023, but we do project a 2.3% growth in external global trade, and this for a region that exports, as I mentioned, will benefit the region. But we are also facing a set of really a wave of protectionism that is restricting access to markets. And just to give you an example, in 2023 alone, last year alone, 3,000 new trade distorting measures were introduced. This is very significant, and it is 3 times the number of such measures introduced in 2019. An additional element is that inflation in major economies outside East Asia Pacific has started to decline. However, core inflation in major trading partners, namely the EU and the US, remains high. And we see labor market conditions in these markets also being quite tight. And that would argue or suggest that we might expect higher interest rates for longer. Domestically, we see that several of the economies in this region are dealing with a higher weight of debt. And this could be public debt, also household debt, and in some countries, corporate debt. They have less fiscal space to stimulate the economy, and fiscal stimulus only goes so far, and also less monetary policy space. In addition, many of the countries are facing, and investors in these countries in particular, are facing greater policy uncertainty on the direction of policies, and this is either related to electoral cycles with potential changes, and really more of a wait-and-see attitude from private sector, or really concern about which direction country is going to take private sector investment in private activity, or opening of certain sectors to private sector activity or foreign direct investment. So quite a bit of policy uncertainty in weighing on the minds of both investors and consumers to a certain extent in some economies. And let me also say a few words on China, the largest economy in the region. The country is really working to develop alternatives to the real estate and infrastructure driven growth of the past few years, and is really trying to attract private investment and encourage the growth of let's say, green economy related activities. It is facing, as traditionally it does, a high savings rate by households, and low domestic consumption. So this means that they really will need to bring up investment, exports, and government spending to the extent that that they can. And in a way, what we see in China is investment shifting from real estate and infrastructure to more advanced manufacturing. And this is good. But it also, some of this investment and some of this manufacturing activity may face either limited domestic demand, but also sometimes obstacles on external domestic markets, not all of which are related to competitiveness, but really more barriers to export. So a much more difficult context for China's recovery. So while countries and governments in this region are thinking about how to stimulate growth further, the report that my colleagues have prepared really focuses and digs deeper into the drivers of long-term growth. A lot of what I've said so far is really about the short-term projections, but really the drivers of long-term growth, and in particular of productivity growth in firms, is really what the rest of the report is about. And as I mentioned, this report has used very interesting firm-level data and has some novel findings that I'm sure you will find interesting. So I'm going to stop now with my introductory remarks. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Aditya Mattu, and I really look forward to this conversation today. So thanks very much, and over to you, Aditya.
Thank you very much, Manuela. I'll just open my presentation. I just want to confirm that you can all see it in presentation mode. Is that right? Okay. You can see me and you can hear me, right?
Yes, Aditya.
Thank you very much. Manuela's excellent introduction has communicated the essence of the report, so I will now flesh out some of the details. Just the three main points. First, the region is growing faster than other countries, but slower than before. Trade, finance, and uncertainty are key determinants of economic performance. And finally, this novel empirical analysis, which demonstrates a key problem in the region, that the leading firms are not playing a leadership role. Let me begin by showing you the big picture. Here you see that the region is still growing faster than the rest of the world. But in almost every country in the region, recent growth is slower than it was in the 5 years before the pandemic. Whether this is temporary or reflects a slower growth trajectory is something that we need to wait and see. When we look at the levels of output and compare them with where the economies were before the pandemic, the good news is that many of the countries in the region today have output much higher than before the pandemic. In China, 20% higher. In Vietnam, 15% higher. The worrying fact is that some of the Pacific islands, to which Manuela referred, still have output which is below pre-pandemic levels. And a concern is that some have tended to regress even further behind. So that is where the region is. The question is why? Now, first, a big picture view of what we see as the key external determinants: trade, protection, and still tight finance, and the three domestic factors: internal increase in indebtedness, the fact is there is less space for macro policy, and the phenomenon of policy uncertainty, which is not just really a domestic, but it's also an external factor. Now, let's look at these quickly in turn. First, the recovery of trade. Even though GDP growth is not expected to be much faster in 2024 than 2023, trade is going to bounce back. First, because incomes had been eroded by inflation in 2023. Now wages are going to restore purchasing power. 2023 was a year when services were being consumed, while goods are more tradable. 2024 is a normalization of patterns of spending. And finally, 2023 was a year when inventories were being used up after having been accumulated in 2022 for a precautionary motive. 2024 is a more normal year. But as against the good news of recovering trade, there is a concern, as Manuela said, about increasing protectionism. 2/3 of these measures constitute industrial policy measures like subsidies, and the remaining third are increases in import protection. And finally, there is the fact that the beast of inflation has been tamed, but it's not out of the picture yet. And there is a concern that interest rates will remain higher for longer. A quick look at industrial policy. What we see, thanks to a database that the IMF has put together with the Global Trade Alert, shows that the prime practitioners of industrial policy today are the industrial countries and the large developing countries, essentially the G20. Now, one aspect of industrial policy is that it is motivated by climate goals. Large subsidies, for example, in China and now in the United States, are being devoted to green industries. And therefore, industrial policy, which might create its own distortions, in fact, is serving the objective of helping the world reduce emissions. The other side of it is, of course, that when an important country like China, which is an important destination for regional exports, but also an important competitor for regions, chooses to subsidize its industries, that makes it harder for the region to export. When another country in the region, like Indonesia, chooses to limit its exports of essential minerals like nickel, that creates a problem for the region. When a very important market for the region, like the United States, chooses to, through the Inflation Reduction Act, support its own industries, that too creates a problem. So the region is squeezed a little bit. And when it does not have the deep pockets, particularly now, nor necessarily the institutions which could provide effective interventions, there is a concern about what the implications of industrial policy in these big countries will be for the smaller countries in the region. Turning now to the domestic issues, as Manuela said, both corporate and household debt are higher today than they were before the pandemic, as is government debt. Interest rates being higher globally limits the scope for interest cuts in the region because of the concern about capital flight, depreciation, and the consequences in terms of inflation, etc. And finally, there is this phenomenon of policy uncertainty, which is today high globally and regionally. And this provokes a particular concern because it induces people to wait and see and therefore inhibits investment. Let's take a look at now the impact of these external and domestic factors on consumption, investment, and exports. Quickly, consumption has really sustained growth in the region, but when you look at the trends of retail sales, which pertain primarily to goods purchases, it's flatter than it was before the pandemic. Now, China presents an interesting picture of sales of goods and services, as this picture presents, really catching up almost with pre-pandemic trends. But the bigger concern is that even though China has tried to rebalance its structure of demand away from dependence on exports and investment towards consumption, consumption in China is still exceptionally low. Not so much because household incomes are low relative to GDP, but because Chinese households have very high levels of savings. One explanation for this is the precautionary motive, because pensions do not cover everybody. Social protection coverage is limited, so people tend to save more for old age and for disasters. Another recent reason is the fact that because property prices have fallen so much, there's a negative wealth effect, which is further squeezing consumption. Now, turning to investment, the situation again is, especially in private investment, a little bit grim because in most countries, private investment today is lower than it was before the pandemic. Again, the fact that interest rates are high, corporate debt is high, and exports have not really picked up are the factors that are pushing or rather dampening private investment. At the same time, indebted governments have not been able to provide, except in China, a significant additional boost to aggregate demand and long-term capacity. Let's turn again to China, which is an important and interesting development there, is that you do see a shift away from real estate investment, which is actually declining, and infrastructure investment, which is growing more slowly, towards investment in manufacturing, where, especially to the sectors which are at the cutting edge, like electrical machinery, computers and communications, and automotive parts. But these are also the sectors which are benefiting from support, whether it's direct assistance or privileged access to finance. For, as you see in this picture, the rates of interest today for the semiconductor industry or computer or autos or batteries are significantly lower than the interest rates faced by the real estate and infrastructure investors. So we see a picture, as Manuela nicely said, of some extent of rebalancing within investment towards more productive sectors, but also raising the concerns about potential mismatches between supply and demand. Now, when you look at exports, again, this combination of reviving demand but eroding protectionism mean that exports have recovered, but not dramatically so. And especially in services and tourism, on which the region depends a lot, many countries do, there is this phenomenon of premature plateauing, that in most countries, the number of tourists and the spending of tourists has now plateaued at levels below pre-pandemic levels. Just bringing all this together, our analysis suggests that not only do changes in the level of foreign output, especially in important countries like the US and China, or changes in monetary policy, especially in the United States, have significant effects on economic activity in the region. But it's not, as I said, just the levels. Uncertainty about future performance abroad, whether it's in China, which is an important market, and the United States, which is even more important for some countries, that uncertainty, for the reasons that I suggested earlier, inhibiting investment, has real effects because people are not sure about where and when and how to invest. And that also has negative shocks on economic activity. So at this stage, resolving uncertainty has a large public good benefit for all countries in the world when it concerns these large markets. Turning now from this big picture macro analysis, as Manuela said, I think one of the highlights of this report is the innovative work led by my colleagues, Jonathan Timmis and Francesca De Nicola, which takes for the first time, I believe, firm level data where it's available and builds a regional picture of micro foundations of growth. But to begin with, let me point to one stylized fact, which is really important, that growth in this region is not driven so much by increases in productivity. That is the more efficient use of resources. Across the region, productivity growth has been low. Growth instead has been driven by investment in machines, in factories, and more so even than increases in human capital, though measurement of the contribution of human capital presents particular challenges. And the concern is that both investment and productivity are now declining. So the long-term prospects of the region, especially in the face of this macro turbulence, will depend critically on what can be done to revive productivity growth. But in order to devise appropriate interventions, we must understand what lies behind this slowing down. So what we find is, first of all, that when you look at the advanced countries today, the firms at the frontier, the larger, more productive firms, are growing much faster than the average firm in the advanced economies. And that is because these new technologies, especially these new digital technologies, have been rapidly adopted by the more advanced firms, and they have raced ahead of everyone else. Interestingly, in our region, the opposite is happening. The less productive firms, that's the green color, in fact are growing much faster than the most productive firms, that's the red color, almost across the region. This in a way turns the old logic upside down, but it has a positive aspect. It is a suggestion that within countries, there's more rapid diffusion of technology, which is facilitating a catch-up by the relatively backward firms. Perhaps you might say that is how it should be. The more productive firms have less scope to increase their productivity than the less productive firms who are catching up. The problem is that there is a growing distance between the most productive firms in the region and the most productive firms in the world. The regional leaders are falling further and further behind the global leaders precisely in the digital intensive sectors where there are the biggest technological opportunities today. Other evidence collected for this report reveals that the regional leaders are also further behind in the adoption of new technologies. Why? When we look at the surveys of different firms, the red here represents the most productive firms' answers, the blue, the slightly less productive firms, the green, even more less lower productivity firms, and the least productive firms are not part of the picture. So you're seeing responses relative to the least productive firms. And you find that the most productive firms complain most about trade regulations, which restrict access to markets, which restrict access to inputs, and prevent them from exploiting economies of scale and participating efficiently in global value chains. They also complain about the inadequacy and unevenness of skills at all levels, from basic skills to more advanced managerial skills, and they complain about the quality of telecommunications and transport infrastructure and services. Interestingly, in regard to competition, new entry, which has often been a force for dynamism in sectors, is slowing down throughout the region. We have shown in our previous report that services reform, services are where most of the protection today is in the region. Reform of services could lead to much bigger increases of productivity in the region, but also in downstream manufacturing sectors which use these services. That is one powerful example of how much competition could induce firms to adopt new technologies and boost their productivity. In management, new data reveals that the most advanced firms are further behind their counterparts in the world than the less advanced firms. In infrastructure, even though access to broadband has improved dramatically, it remains uneven within and across countries in the region. The prescriptions are relatively cliched, but ideally informed by the more nuanced evidence we have presented. There's a need for increased competition, especially by eliminating explicit barriers in services and implicit barriers in goods. We need greater investments in skills and better infrastructure. To conclude, this report shows that this region is outperforming the world, but underachieving relative to its own potential. That the firms which are leaders and which should be showing the way to all other firms in their countries are not performing that leadership role. In terms of policy, we need greater macro predictability and more micro competition, and finally, enhanced capacity, especially digital and education. Thank you very much. I hope I'm going to try and stop sharing now and turn to the question answer. And I would like to begin this session by turning to my first esteemed panelist, Dr. Khatib Basri, who I shall represent or refer to, as everybody in Indonesia does, as Pak Dede. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining. It's great to see you again.
Good to see you.
My first question to you is, Indonesia has been growing at a respectable 5% before the pandemic. It's projected to grow at a respectable 5%. You're also at a point where there is a change in governments. When you see the drivers of growth so far, what do you think has been most important in terms of its relatively strong performance? And what do you think is necessary for a growth that is closer to the aspirations of the government and the Indonesian people?
Well, first of all, I would like to congratulate for your excellent presentation, Aditya. I enjoyed very much. A couple of things regarding the performance. The first one, I do believe that one of the key reasons why Indonesia has been able to maintain a relatively strong growth is because the good macroeconomic stability policy. So if you look at on the fiscal side and monetary policy side, both monetary authority and fiscal authority has been able to provide the macro stability, which is somehow this also will provide the good ground for the investment to come to Indonesia. But I think the most important one, if you look at the contribution of growth, the biggest source of growth come from the private consumption. Basically, Indonesia is more than 50%. And one of the reasons was because Indonesia has been able to maintain the inflation relatively low compared to many countries in the region, even when the other countries had quite relatively high inflation. And the reason behind it was because during the pandemic, the fiscal stimulus launched by the government was relatively low compared to many countries in the world. We only had a budget deficit around 6%, in which 3% was the automatic stabilizer because the collapse of the tax revenue. Yeah, so that's basically, in addition to that, when you mentioned about the slowdown of the global economy, I would say that we were lucky because our export share to GDP is relatively small. It's only 25%. So the negative spillover to the global economy is relatively limited. Now to your second question, Indonesia is really maybe a good example about your report. Why? Because your data shows that our investment in GDP is relatively high, even higher compared to many countries in the region. But if you look at the economic growth, it's only 5%. So the reason behind it is because productivity is relatively low, because our incremental capital output ratio is relatively high. So to answer to your question, to achieve the 6 or 7% economic growth, I do believe that the policy that the government should pursue is to improve productivity by improving the quality of human capital, continue to build an infrastructure, and also the improvement of good governance. The second one, there is a problem of the saving investment gap here, because if we want to grow by 6 to 7%, we probably need about investment over GDP around 41% or even 47%. So definitely, if we want to boost the economic growth to 7%, we need the FDI. Yeah, so that's very important to attract the foreign direct investment to come to Indonesia. Or you narrow the gap by increasing the tax revenue, not by increasing the tax rate, but you do the reform on the administrative reform and also maybe reduce the coverage of the exemption.
Thank you very much, Padre. At some point, maybe today, maybe later, you could also talk a little bit about the competition, the fact that Indonesia's investment reform hasn't really been accompanied by trade reform. But before I turn to my colleague, Lalitha Murthy, I have a question for Ms. Omar, Irene Omar, who is one of the protagonists of growth. She's a leader of a successful firm, AirAsia. My question to you is, you heard our story about how somehow the leading firms in the region are not quite playing the role of leaders, while fortunately, the more lagging firms are beginning to catch up. Is this consistent with your view of where regional firms stand? And what do you see as the main obstacles to productivity growth faced by, dynamic companies like AirAsia?
Thank you very much, Aditya. in relation to your question, whether the leaders, the leaders as it was before, are they really completely leading now, or are they lagging behind? That question to me actually depends on how the companies have been embracing digitalization even before the pandemic. Because what we have seen, those who probably did not embrace digitalization and they were happy with what they were doing before because they said that, well, we've been doing well, we've been doing very, very well. So why do we need to become more data driven? Why do we need to embrace technology and so forth? And you would find them lagging behind, especially after the pandemic. And it's a struggle for them to scale up immediately. Now, with our case, we've been embracing technology since day one, since we first started the airline, because of the fact that we want to be a little bit more cost efficient than others so that we can offer lower fares for many in the region that we serve. And we've been embracing digitalization from the beginning. But having said that, although we are ahead in terms of digital transformation, in terms of becoming more data-driven and so forth, to restart a business where we have over 200 aircraft, it's more difficult than to restart a business with 10 or 20 aircraft. So I do understand why certain organizations, when they were global leaders, they were probably not leading as much as they used to be because of the fact of restarting the whole operations, especially for us, right? 3 years of not flying. That's 3 years of no revenue. How do we do this? We have assets, huge assets. As before, when we first started, we only have 2 aircraft, and now we have 200 aircraft. And how do we get people back and make sure that they're not demoralized anymore? There's work for them to look forward to and so forth. But in any case, the digital part of our business, which is the e-commerce, the logistics, the fintech business that we created, we saw that the productivity growth has increased a lot. But then again, when we built these digital businesses, we were relying on the aviation businesses' assets that we could take advantage of. So if that didn't move as fast as we could, then there's only a limitation of growth that these digital businesses could actually experience. So that's my point of view, basically, in relation to, do we have the right talent to bring this up faster? Do we have the efficiency that we could actually enjoy as what we used to? Because of now we have far greater assets and far greater resources that we need to start thinking on how to use them efficiently. So it will take time for larger companies to be able to adopt their operations in a more efficient manner rather than immediately they be able to do so. So that's my point of view.
Thank you very much, Ms. Omar. This is very helpful. I was going to reserve a special set of I'm trying to also collect the questions that are coming in on the digital agenda, and we'll come back to it. But more generally, Lalitha, you heard from Pak Dede about the broader sort of reform agenda and challenges. You heard about Ms. Omar about the very specific transition, the post-pandemic challenges, the assets, the human capital challenges. Is this consistent with what you, as a leader on these issues, both the macro and the micro and the banks, see as the key challenges in the region? Or are you thinking in terms of also other reforms that are priorities?
Thank you very much, Aditya. Good morning, good afternoon to you and to all our participants in this seminar. Dr. Basri's and Ms. Omar's observations are broadly in line with our thinking. Obviously, macro stability, fiscal prudence, the quality of physical human capital, the importance of FDI, these are broadly in line with our thinking. But taking a step back, as I have recently joined this region, I observed that all the countries have set very ambitious goals for themselves, and that's very good. Many want to become high-income countries in a decade or so. So what this implies is that they have to take bold actions, which I would broadly group them into kind of 4 sets of interrelated actions. First, of course, countries need to continue on the path of broad structural reforms if they want to raise productivity and growth. Structural reforms not only raise productivity in the sectors that they are undertaken, as you've mentioned, Aditya, but they can also have positive spillovers for the rest of the economy. Just to give you a very simple example, in Vietnam, reforms that lowered restrictions on transport, finance, and business sectors during 2008 and 16 led to about a 2.9% annual increase in labor productivity in these sectors. But what is more interesting is that these reforms led to a 3.1% increase in productivity in manufacturing firms that used services inputs, and they benefited mostly the SMEs. So it's a win-win all around because of the positive spillovers these kinds of structural reforms can have. I think the second set of actions that are important and crucial are that countries need to develop a conducive entrepreneurial ecosystem that boosts firm productivity, firm level productivity. And this also involves addressing regulatory barriers that tend to protect incumbents, they constrain new entry, and they stifle competition in general. The third thing that is important is that countries need to remove policy distortions that make the playing field uneven, particularly with respect to state-owned enterprises. In this region, and also in the regions that I've worked before, it's quite obvious that SOEs tend to be less productive. They have lower returns on assets than private companies, but for some reason tend to benefit more from state aid in several forms. And so it's very important to level the playing field for the private sector. And finally, I think countries should encourage low carbon transformation that takes advantage of emerging global green opportunities. So plenty of studies have shown that jobs can be created in the renewable energy sector. And these jobs are not tied to any particular location. So any country that takes the right policies and incentives can attract these jobs. But you have several domestic distortions, such as subsidies for fuel, agriculture, irrigation. All this can inhibit transition to renewables and green jobs. Of course, you know, the devil is in the detail. It differs by country. It has to be tailored to each and every country. But these would be the broad sets of reforms that I would identify.
Thank you very much, Lalita. That is a very comprehensive list. Your example on services very nicely echoes the evidence we present in the report. And on the green thing, you know, I agree, you know, where there are distortionary fuel subsidies, as in Malaysia, Indonesia has done a lot to phase them out. I agree with you, that's a win-win. Whether when you introduce more proactive measures to support green, like carbon taxes, what happens to the jobs you create and what happens to the jobs you destroy, I think it's still a little bit an open question. We need to understand the trade-offs better. But I agree with all that you said. Let me turn to Bhakti. You know, you have written in your very insightful papers about how crisis precipitate reforms, of how, for example, during COVID, we saw in Indonesia this really, you know, seminal reform of the omnibus law. Then there was also reforms on taxes, on finance. So my question to you is, what is your strategy for reform in normal times? And how do you think of the political economy of reform, both in Indonesia and more generally?
This is a tough question. Let me try to answer to your questions. Let me respond by quoting what Jean-Claude Juncker said, the former president for European Commission. He said that we all know what to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it. And that's really the political economy problem. So I'm humbled by the political reality, Aditya. So my suggestion is we have to consider the political economy factor. So perhaps the reform, the strategy is try to do reform in which that easiest to be done, but the marginal gain is very high. So you create a success story. Once you create a success story, you gather the political support, then you move to the more complex and difficult reform. Because once people feel the benefit of it, you gather the political support. So I can give an example. If you do reform, for example, during the COVID, the government decision regarding providing vaccine, for example, that will be justified even when the government, if they at that time they need to adjust the fuel price to reduce the subsidy. But if we gave the money to to support the poor people and also the health sector, I think they will gain the political support. So back to your question again, I think the strategy is try to create a success story. Yeah, once people feel the benefit of it, you gain the political support and you move to the more complex and difficult reform.
Okay, let me talk about a particularly difficult reform, and this question for Ms. Omar. Ms. Omar, air transport, I used to work in the World Trade Organization, and the one service that was excluded was air transport, because it was so hard to liberalize these restrictive bilateral air service agreements that fragment the world, limit competition. My question to you is, as an important player in this area, we know that some countries have begun to negotiate open skies agreement, but there's often a tension between supporting national champions and even small countries like Laos, PDR, and others, which would benefit a lot from tourism, keep restricting air transport in a way that imposes a cost on them. So the tension between supporting national champions and reaping benefits, what kind of policy reforms would you like to see within the region or more broadly? And what do you see as the prospects for regional firms?
Thank you, Adia. I think there are many regional reforms that we would like to see to ensure that ASEAN, Southeast Asia, become the regional, a true hub in terms of not just transportation, tourism, but other forms of economic activity. And you can only do that and you have connectivity, real connectivity into various cities, not just capital cities, but secondary cities and tertiary cities in the region. We've been championing ASEAN Open Skies since 2012 or so. And the reason why this is really valuable for all economies is that you will get more connectivity and hence a better economic growth for every country, basically. Now, the problem with Southeast Asia is that ASEAN is based on consensus. So it's not like Euro, where you have 3 or 4 countries who will go for it, and then the rest will follow. Here, you need to have everyone to be agreeable to have their skies open, basically. And we do find that it's very difficult for a particular country, especially, to open their skies, because that would mean that it will defeat or it will challenge their regional hub status in the region and so forth. And there are many aspects. It's not just open skies that we look at, where we could fly freely as how you see in Europe. But we are also looking at how do we harmonize and standardize all the regulatory requirements in relation to air transportation and so forth. So it's not just about ownership, because here we have a limitation of how a carrier can only have the majority ownership, and only foreign ownership has to hold a minority. We see that changing, especially in the Philippines, where you see that foreigners can own 100% of an airline. So that's a good step, but it takes years for us to negotiate for those. Then the second part would be, how do you harmonize the requirements for pilots to be able to fly anywhere in the countries in the region? Because each country has different requirements of pilot licensing. Each country has different requirements for cabin crew licensing and so forth, as well as engineering as well. So you can't mobilize your workforce. So if we have a workforce in Malaysia who would want to move into Thailand because there's growth in Thailand, and we want to move aircraft there too, it's a very tedious process. We have to deregister our aircraft and then re-register it in Thailand. And then we need to be able to get the pilots to be retrained and have the right kind of license to be able to operate in Thailand and so forth. So it's not an overnight thing. It's probably going to take 2 months before we can mobilize aircraft around the region if we want to place them in a certain countries and so forth. And hence the reason why you have Malaysian registered aircraft and Thai registered aircraft and what they can do and what they cannot do. The air traffic controller also has got different sets of rules and so forth. So it's not very efficient. So yes, we embrace this very much. We do not think it will hamper the national status of the airline and so forth, because it's for the betterment of the country. It's for the good of the country. You get better economic activities, you get better tourism numbers and so forth, and better growth prospects.
That's, a very powerful narrative. One day we should also have a longer conversation about the political economy of reform in air transport, because ASEAN has done important things, as Lalitha said, which, like, for example, Vietnam transport reform has had downstream benefits. So how can we make a more effective case? But, one aspect of how firms are helped, as Manuela said at the beginning, this is a region that has thrived through openness to trade. But now you see across the world, as I mentioned a little while ago, a resort to industrial policies now. And they take different forms. Some places there are subsidies, some places there are export restrictions, for example, in Indonesia today. So I'm going to put my friend Pak Dede in an awkward position. Do you see these industrial policies delivering good development outcomes? And if you do, and if you see some successes, what do you think are the criteria for successful industrial policy intervention?
A couple of things, Aditya. I think there is a difference about the type of industrial policy in the 90s and now. In the 90s, maybe the idea of industrial policy is to get country ahead. But now there is a tendency, industrial policy, for hurting others. Yeah, so this industrial policy is very costly. I can imagine country like United States with the Inflation Reduction Act, they can afford to provide a subsidy. But what about the developing countries in which the fiscal space are very limited? So to me, if there is a justification for the industrial policy, I call it is a sober industrial policy in which perhaps you provide a subsidy or government support to do training, for example, or R&D. And even for that, maybe the ability for the government to provide training is limited. So one way to do it is, why don't we ask private sector to do a training and give the double deduction of tax? So that kind of industrial policy, to me, that probably can fostering the growth. But, in terms of this protectionist policy or subsidy, I'm not so sure, unless you subsidize the global public goods, like you subsidize, for climate in the advanced country, this will benefit the emerging economies.
Thank you very much, Pak Dede. Let me similarly put my colleague Lalitha in a difficult position. For years, the World Bank has espoused, not picking winners, about horizontal support for infrastructure, for education, for the business environment. Can I ask you for a short, crisp answer on where does the bank stand now on industrial policy?
Thanks, Aditya. Indeed, you're putting me in a difficult spot by asking this question. Industrial policy has become a hot topic recently, and it's being debated quite heatedly by the academics. It's playing out in the media. It also comes up in our dialogue with governments in the region, and it's particularly playing out with relation to green transition and whether countries should adopt industrial policy to let this happen. But in my view, it's not an either-or debate. We're not debating whether broad reforms that improve business climate or sector-specific industrial policies, which one is better or not. I think that's a false choice. First, as I mentioned previously, broad reforms are needed to improve the business climate. They remain very essential to raise productivity and economic growth. They are fundamental to deliver good jobs, prosperous societies. In fact, there's research on China's growth story that has more to do with productivity improvements in agriculture and allowing foreign direct investment in manufacturing than it has to do directly with industrial policy. Now, should countries adopt industrial policy to speed up green transition? And that seems to be the bigger question now. Should they follow US, the EU, China in implementing a large industrial policy program? And I don't think the answer to this is very obvious. First, industrial policy is risky. It can exacerbate existing distortions in an economy and can be captured by powerful incumbents and can prove to be extremely costly. And second, recent evidence has shown that for successful industrial policy, you need to have a very high quality bureaucracy. And to implement this, you need to have that kind of a professional capability in these countries. So if countries are going to be doing or conducting industrial policy, they need to be very clear-eyed about the risks and costs involved and make sure that they don't outweigh the benefits. I think that just very broadly, if one were to look at how to think about industrial policy, we should really ask ourselves 4 questions. Does it achieve the desired objective? Does the government have the financial and administrative capacity to do this? Are there policy spillovers? And is there scope for cross-country coordination to maximize benefits? And not just be what Dr. Basri called beggar thy neighbor policies. That's not probably where we should be going with industrial policy. So it really, really requires clear thinking, and there is no obvious answer to this.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lalitha. If I can just give 1 minute to my guests, Pak Dede and Ms. Omar, on this tension between greening and growth. At the macro level, 1 minute for Pak Dede, 1 minute for Ms. Omar, as we think of new fuels and so on. How do you see it from a developing country perspective, Pak Dede? Big picture and a firm level.
I do believe that, transition into the green economy, we need to be undertaken carefully. But if you're talking about long term, I do believe that the benefit will be much bigger than the cost, because I do believe that the stronger economic growth will occur with the green economy in the future.
Well, for us, fuel is the biggest component of cost. So if we can reduce that cost as much as we could, and we will be doing that, and even before using SAF, SAF is the alternative to jet fuel, and SAF is very expensive in relation to what the jet fuel price is. It's multiples or so. What we generally do is to make sure that our operations are efficient. How do we fly the planes with very less fuel consumption? So the pilots has been trained to do that. Air traffic controller also plays a part, so that the plane do not have to taxi a long time or have to make circles before they can land. So how do we make that more efficient and so forth? So I think that's the heart of the matter, on how do we reduce the consumption of fuel with better aircraft, with more efficient aircraft, with better pilot trained to fly the planes, with air traffic controller and other parts of the activities within turn around the aircraft and so forth plays a big role.
Very much to my brilliant panelists, Pak Dede, Ms. Omar, Lalitha. I'm really grateful for a very stimulating conversation. Before I hand over to Manuela, I just want to thank you all. I want to thank Manuela, who has provided a firm foundation for economic analysis in our region. Ergis Islamai, who leads our work on this update. Zungle and Daisuke Fukuzawa, who provided critical analysis, and Jonathan Timis and Francesca De Nicola, who did an amazing job on the firm level work. And finally, Carolyn and our excellent media people who have managed this whole event flawlessly, and much else. Thank you very much to everybody, and over to you, Manuela, for the final word.
Thank you very much, Aditya. And let me start by thanking our very distinguished panelists that joined us today, and your team, Aditya, for the work that they've done. This is really as much a piece of analytics and diagnostics and recommendations as it is also to stimulate a discussion and a debate on what policy prescriptions and investments will carry growth in this region forward. And I think this is a time of that requires proactive policy making. Some of the discussions on industrial policy are very topical. At the end of the day, I do think that it matters whether this industrial policy is to protect old firms and old technology and prevent exit or entry, or whether they have a forward-looking approach. So I think that part of the discussion in terms of simplifying investment regimes, providing a level playing field between enterprises, regardless of ownership, the issue of private versus SOE, state-owned enterprises, and having the same ability to operate without crowding out the private sector in particular. These are all very material. The point of resolving the policy uncertainty is also critical. Where there is policy uncertainty to elections with new governments coming on board, the sooner new government can send policy direction and a sense of comfort to both households and private enterprises, the better. This is a time when businesses would like clarity on what's the investment regime that they will be operating under. So that is very critical. Another source of growth is really opening up sectors to economic activity that has been closed to potential investors. And here, services across the region really offers the greatest potential. And related to that, competition enhancing policies will also help attract more companies and more investors into economic activity. At the end of the day, we are at a time when there's only so much fiscal or monetary stimulus that would carry growth in these economies over the long run. Only structural reforms and really policy changes that change incentives for firms and that encourage them to be more productive. Only those types of actions from the government side can sustain growth over the long run, and that is what this region is looking for. The last point I would mention is really about human capital. These countries, going from middle-income countries to upper and to high-income countries, will require different skills, will require human capital that has the ability and the capabilities to adopt, manage, and change with new technology. And this applies both to workers in firms, but it also applies to management. And the stage of development in which many of the countries in this region is really requires that upskilling of the labor force, especially at a time when so much of the world is embracing AI, and so basic digital skills are going to be so critical. But also in some of our countries, also where you see an aging of the population, shrinking the labor force. So the innovation and the productivity enhancements that we that we see are needed in these firms to regain that competitiveness that the region has had in the past, really require an investment in human capital. Of course, the policy mix in each of the countries will be different depending on the initial conditions, on what ends up being the set of binding constraints to further growth. But we hope that with a better dialogue between households, firms, and governments, and with inputs of institutions like ours, that we can help move this agenda forward and bring more wind into the sails of growth in East Asia and the Pacific. So I'm going to conclude here. I'm going to thank you all for your participation and your questions that I know you submitted. And again, thank you, Aditya and our panelists for joining us today. So have a good evening or a good morning, wherever you may be and wherever you will have joined us from. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bhakti. Thank you.